Question! Was an expensive system to collect for in 2018, but it's still an awesome system. Answer, the Sega Saturn. You guys know I love the Sega Saturn. I had a love affair with it back in the day. I still currently love it, but let's face the facts. Let's be honest. It was nowhere near as successful as the PlayStation 1. The PlayStation 1 pretty much decimated it in North America. And because of this, Sega Saturn software sales were low because hardware sales were low. So companies didn't produce as many copies of North American games as they did for something like the PS1. You could walk into a Goodwill and find stacks of PS1 games. You're not finding Saturn games though. So because of this, Sega Saturn collecting has gotten extremely expensive when you're talking about North American releases. But over on the other side of the world in Japan, the Sega Saturn was pretty much in a bizarro state because it was actually pretty successful. So a lot of games that came out in North America also released in Japan, and because of this, they had bigger print runs. There were also Japanese exclusives that Americans and people who don't speak Japanese can still enjoy with pretty good consistency. So in this video, I want to spotlight both types of those games. Games that only released in Japan that are, able for English people to enjoy, and games that also had a bigger run in Japan that you could still enjoy in North America without having to understand Japanese. So sit back, relax, and today we're going to talk about Japanese imports for the Sega Saturn that you should definitely check out.
Hey, RGT 85. Hey, Sean.
Oh my God, it's Stevie Richards! Now, before we get into talking about Japanese imports for the Sega Saturn, I do want to mention the easiest and, in my opinion, the best way to play these things. You can get a Japanese Sega Saturn, and that's cool, but if you own a North American Sega Saturn, you have to pick up the Action Replay Plus. Now, what this is basically, it plugs into the cartridge slot of your Sega Saturn, and it allows you to use the 4 megabytes of RAM, which is going to be essential for one of the games on this list. Beyond that, it allows you to play Japanese imports on your Sega Saturn as well, and it has a built-in cheat system as well. So it's sort of like a Game Shark type of product. Now, this retails for anywhere from about $30 to $40. And so if you're serious about collecting for the Sega Saturn and you want to play these Japanese games, you're definitely going to need to pick this up. So I highly recommend you get one of these before even considering importing Japanese Saturn things. But for 30 or 40 bucks, it's more than worth it because you'll be saving so much money by picking up these Japanese games instead of their North American counterparts in some cases that honestly it's going to pay for itself. So this is the Action Replay Plus. You can pick them up on eBay, Amazon, wherever, but make sure you get one. The first game I want to talk about is probably my favorite light gun game of all time, and definitely my favorite Saturn light gun game. It might not look as good as its arcade counterpart, but this game was just so much fun back in the day because it was essentially Resident Evil as a light gun game, and that is House of the Dead. Now, when you're talking about House of the Dead, you immediately know, if you know anything about Saturn collecting, it is super expensive. A complete in-box copy is like 150 bucks plus. So you might be saying to yourself, this isn't an affordable game, why are you talking about it? The game released in Japan though, and the Japanese version is dirt cheap. The Japanese version of this game is only about $20 to $25, and you're getting a top-notch arcade light gun shooter. Sure, the graphics haven't really fared all that well. The voice acting is pretty cheesy, but the voice acting is actually all in English. Now, the text is in Japanese, but it's very easy to follow this game. It's very easy to see what's going on because it's a light gun shooter. Shoot the zombies, figure out your paths and whatnot. It's an excellent game. The only real difference as far as graphics are concerned is that the blood in the game is green as opposed to red, and it doesn't seem like there's a way around that. I guess it was just some weird Japanese thing, but honestly, considering this game is a fraction of the price for the Japanese copy, it's well worth picking up. I'm not going to pay $150 for it. I'll pay $20 to $25 for the Japanese copy, and that is actually what I did. I probably will never own the North American copy, and I don't care because I'm totally happy with the Japanese copy. It's the exact same game, very import friendly, and I definitely recommend picking it up. Now, this next game is definitely another import-friendly game of a more expensive North American counterpart, and that is Dynamite Deka. Now, Dynamite Deka in North America is known as Die Hard Arcade, and the only main difference in this game is that they made John McClane the lead character. Even though he looks the same pretty much as he does in Dynamite Deka, they put in a few Die Hard references for the North American release, and the North American release is a very highly sought-after game. And the Japanese version, once again, is about a fraction of the price, around $20 $20 to $25 for this version, whereas the North American version could be $80 or more for a complete in-box version. Dynamite Deka is a really fun beat-em-up game with 3D areas. You're trying to save the kidnapped president's daughter and all sorts of stuff. Very cheesy stuff. It hardly even ties into Die Hard, but because of the Die Hard references, it is one of my favorite movie games of all time. Even if you strip away the movie references though, it is an excellent game, and the fact that you could pick up the Japanese version for very cheap and still enjoy the game because it's just a beat 'em up, you'll have a lot of fun with this game. If you've ever wanted to experience Die Hard Arcade but don't want to shell out the big bucks, Dynamite Deka is an excellent substitute because it's the same game. The next game I want to talk about was a Japanese-only release for the Sega Saturn, and arguably the best fighting game, 2D fighter, on the system, and that is X-Men vs. Street Fighter. Now, X-Men vs. Street Fighter is an amazing port of the arcade classic. It looks so good, damn near arcade quality, but since it came out on the tail end of the Sega Saturn's life cycle, it never saw a North American release. So you would think that the Japanese version of this game would be super expensive, right? But it's not. It's surprisingly affordable. I picked up a complete copy for about $40 a couple months ago, and I just pop in my Action Replay with the 4MB card built into it, and I can enjoy the game on my Sega Saturn. It looks great, it plays great, and language barrier isn't really a bad thing here because there is none. It's a standard 2D fighting game. You probably know how to play the game, you know how to throw Hadokens. You're not missing out much with the Japanese text. An excellent arcade fighting game, a definite must-own for Saturn collectors, and the fact that it's Japanese only doesn't really hinder the ability to import this because it's still super cheap on eBay. So X-Men vs. Street Fighter, a must-own in your game collection. The next game I want to talk about is a Japanese-only racing game, and that's Daytona USA Circuit Edition. Now, in North America, two versions of Daytona USA came out, the original Daytona USA and Daytona USA Championship Circuit Edition. The main difference between these two was an upgrade in graphics. Daytona USA was severely rushed to be alongside the launch of the Sega Saturn, and unfortunately it has sub 30 frame per second frame rates, but the music is awesome. I love that original Daytona USA soundtrack from the arcade. It's so good. The game is still definitely playable, but when you play a Championship Circuit Edition, you can see that it's much better. It's much more refined. The big problem is they stripped away the original music and did a remix soundtrack, and I like that. You know, it's still cool, but it doesn't quite feel the same. Now, a third version came out in Japan only called Daytona USA Circuit Edition, and this features more improvements to the handling system, better graphics, a slightly better frame rate, better colors, better textures, and more importantly, it has both soundtracks on there. So if you love that original Daytona USA soundtrack, but you want the refinements of Championship Circuit Edition that came out in Japan only, which is very cheap to pick up, has the best of all worlds. It is an excellent version of the arcade game and another cheap game to pick up. So if you're into Daytona USA, it's the definitive version on the Sega Saturn, Japan only, but you could definitely import it. The next game I want to talk about is a wrestling game that only released in Japan, and it's pretty impressive. It's something I picked up for about 10 bucks a couple months ago, and I really enjoyed it. And that's All Japan Pro Wrestling featuring Virtua. This is a 3D wrestling game, which you didn't really see at that time. Those things didn't really start until the N64 era, and then of course when we got the SmackDown vs. Raw series. But this is actually a pretty technically impressive wrestling game based on Japanese wrestling. All Japan Pro Wrestling was a big company at the time. There's some gaijins in there like Stan Henson and Dr. Death Steve Williams, along with Japanese legends in the game. What makes this game pretty interesting though is the inclusion of Jeffrey and Wolf from the Virtua Fighter series, and it's pretty fun, honestly. It's a pretty realistic style wrestling game. It has sort of that Japanese spirit meter as well. There's a lot of cool moves in it. There is a bit of a learning curve because this game is in Japanese only, but there's tons of FAQs out there that really ease you into it and explain the game's mechanics. After about 10 to 15 minutes of reading an FAQ, you will be perfectly accustomed to this game. It's a really good looking game, a really fun game, and it's a really solid wrestling game that not a lot of people talk about. So All Japan Pro Wrestling featuring Virtua, another cheap, dirt cheap Japanese import that needs to be in your Saturn collection. One of the most expensive games to come across is Saturn Bomberman in North America. This game fetches up to over $400 for a complete in-box copy. But did you know that there's a Japanese version? Did you know that the Japanese version is Bomberman? Did you know that you could do the 8-person multiplayer that was famous for the Sega Saturn version with this Japanese version? And did you know that the Japanese version is dirt cheap? Once again, this is another game that you can get in America, but it's much cheaper in Japan, and it's Bomberman. You know how to play Bomberman. You put bombs down and they blow up stuff. It's Bomberman. So another cheap edition that you must get for the Sega Saturn. One of the finest and highly sought after games, but just get the Japanese version. Save you some money. The final game I want to talk about is definitely the toughest game to import, just from a language barrier standpoint. But in my opinion, it's worth it. And it's tough because you pretty much have to have a GameFAQs FAQ up on a computer next to you the entire time, but that is Deep Fear. Now, Deep Fear is an awesome game. It has all voice acting in English, so that is a plus if you're trying to follow the story. The gameplay, unfortunately, as far as reading things and instructions in the game, is all in Japanese, but if you're a fan of old school survival horror, Deep Fear is a game that you really need to experience. It was developed by Sega as sort of an answer to the lack of Resident Evil 2 on the Sega Saturn, and it's just a really fun game. It takes place underwater, so you're constantly having to refill your oxygen meter. There's interesting characters, there's interesting story twists, and it's just that classic, tank style controls survival horror game. It's not a super expensive game to pick up when you import it from Japan. I think I paid about $30 for my complete copy, and it's really well worth playing, especially if you're a fan of survival horror. Like I said, all the voices are in English, but the text is in Japanese, so you will need some help with this game, but honestly, for it being the hardest game on this list, it's definitely worth checking out. Alright, and honestly, that's just a fraction of Japanese games. I plan on doing another one of these because I have a lot of Japanese Saturn games that I want to talk about. I haven't even gotten to the shmups, even though a lot of them are going up in price because they were Japanese exclusive and they're highly sought after. There's a lot of amazing versions of Street Fighter that you could pick up as well. Tons of fighting games. There's actually a 3D fighter that I was going to mention in this video, but I think I'm going to save it for the next one. But this is definitely a great start. If you're just getting into Sega Saturn collecting, I highly recommend picking up the Action Replay and picking up some of these games. They're some of the best on the system, and they're a fraction of the price if they came out in North America, or in the case of a game like X-Men vs. Street Fighter, that was the only way to get it. And it's such a timeless game, such an amazing Saturn game. I think everyone will love that game. So let me know in the comment section some of your favorite Sega Saturn imports. Maybe they were on my original list, or maybe I'm saving them for part 2, or maybe you'll introduce me to something new that I need to import and spend money on. And thank you for checking out this video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit that like button. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe. Leave me your thoughts in the comment section down below. Be sure to check out the description box. We got all sorts of links down there. Patreon, t-shirts, social media. Follow me everywhere. Keep up to date with RGT 85. And I'll catch you guys next time. Later.
RGT 85! RGT 85!